So when Ambassador Emmanuel spoke this morning, he discussed how he thought that our current time was being shaped by 3 C's: COVID, conflict, and coercion. And all of those forces have also played a role on the subject of our panel here, supply chains. So COVID, and especially the zero COVID policies in China, another C, were a huge shock and really spurred a lot of the de-risking measures we've seen, like nearshoring and friendshoring, in the aftermath of the pandemic. Then we saw the second C, conflict, create huge stresses on global food security when Russia invaded Ukraine. And the third C, coercion, is part of the potential toolkit that governments can use on supply chains to do things like protect national security, craft industrial policy, and influence other countries. We're going to explore the collective effects of some of these forces with our panel today. We have experts from 3 different critical industries whose supply chains have shifted in different ways over the past several years. And at the end, we would love to hear some of your questions if you have them, so please listen carefully to what our panelists have to say and prepare some of your own questions or comments for the end. So we're going to dive in first with some case studies from across the different industries that our panelists work on. So Ambassador Clem, one of the industries that during the pandemic became far more critical for national security than probably ever had been was, of course, healthcare. So how has the pharmaceutical industry in particular made adjustments with regard to its supply chains during COVID and or after?
Thank you, Caitlin. Let me first just supplement the kind introduction that I received. I'm the Japan representative for PhRMA, and PhRMA is a trade organization headquartered in Washington, D.C. that represents 30 of the major innovative pharmaceutical manufacturers in the world. And that innovative word is very important because it's going to influence about my comments regarding the industry and what's happened to it in the past 4 or 5 years. There's another segment, the generics industry, which is quite different and has had much different challenges than the innovative industry. On supply chains for pharmaceutical industry, during the course of today's discussion, words like resilience, continuity, trust were all used to describe essential elements of a functioning supply chain. That certainly was true for the pharmaceutical industry. We actually did very, very well during the pandemic. There were no significant shortages or disruptions to the distribution of medicines, particularly in the developed world, but also mostly in the developing world as well. And this was particularly true for the vaccines. Once they were developed, they were quickly distributed in the terms of billions of doses, testifying to the strength and resiliency of pharmaceutical supply chains around the world. And these were developed over decades, of course, and they're testimony to the trust that has emerged not only within the industry, but also in the countries where the industry is prominent, and including in the United States and in Japan. The rolling out the vaccines, of course, was also the result of just tremendous science and the development of that science over decades. The extraordinary cooperation between industry and regulators, and then also across industry. What had to be done in 2020-21 was a ramping up of manufacturing that any one company could not do on its own. So through partnerships, that manufacturing and production capacity was found in order to bring the vaccines to patients around the world. So for us, going through COVID, one of the C's, we discovered that our supply chains proved to be very effective. It's a good story.
Wonderful. Asai-san, you do a lot of work on energy security with a focus on the Indo-Pacific region. So can you talk about some of the supply chain shifts that Japan and other countries in the region have undertaken with regard to energy security?
So for Japan, energy security has always been a challenge. Our energy self-sufficiency is only 12%. So that is why we were fortunate to build a reliable energy supply chain with countries like Australia, where we depend 40% of our LNG imports and 60% of our coal imports. But today, the energy security landscape has become much more complex due to geopolitical challenges, the extreme weather conditions due to climate change, the shift in decarbonization, and the continuous inflationary pressure. And it requires a whole new way of approach, a new way of thinking in terms of energy security and supply chain. And when it comes to the supply chain of energy, we are not just talking about the fuel sources themselves, but also about the equipment. So these are solar panels, wind turbines, gas turbines, transformers, batteries, electrolyzers. So the companies that manufacture these energy equipments have been building a complex global supply chain, diversifying, de-risking, and modernizing in order to adapt to the needs. And the supply chain decisions are made not only on geopolitics, but also based on market conditions, access to talent, also global competitiveness, and this whole new, where it makes sense in terms of policy and regulation. And speaking of policy and regulations, countries have pledged ambitious decarbonization goals, coupled with large, huge investment incentive programs. And this has, for starting with the US, there's the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which has really changed the center of gravity in terms of where companies invest in the next few years. India has made in India policy with the production-linked incentives. So many Japanese companies are shifting their supply chain to India. And similarly, in Australia, there is the capacity investment scheme, and in Japan, the Green Innovation Fund. So all of these government-driven incentive programs have created this kind of fierce competition within the market. So even between the friendly nations, it's a delicate balance between competition and cooperation when it comes to energy security and energy supply chain.
Right. So we have a success story from COVID with healthcare. We have some co-opetition in energy. Let's look at the semiconductor industry, Koshiba-san. Can you highlight for us how some of these trends have manifested in supply chains for semiconductors?
Yeah, thank you, Kathleen. And I've been in semiconductor industry for more than 40 years. So I've seen the up and down of this industry, right? And this is a little bit unusual, moment. And just like Ian kind of started talking about geopolitical recession in 2017. Looking at the whole history of the geopolitics, everything's really, tells us, we are in a downtrend, and this is going to continue, for a long time. I would say, this is a time of the war, and the war will be fought in three ways: military, economy, and technology. So right now, the global, politics is trying to contain, all the conflicts within a region. But economy and technology, there's no mercy, right? There will be a fierce competition among the countries. So for that, really, it points to one technology, which is a computation. Computation power and the resources is going to determine the competitiveness of any country and any given, corporations. For that, semiconductor is going to be a core technology to support computation for the next, few decades. So semiconductor used to be one of the industries, but it's now, should be recognized as the foundation of the society, foundation of national order. That's how we take, semiconductors. And just like Hans said, it's so expensive to develop, semiconductor technologies. I do see a lot of similarity between the semiconductor industry and the pharmaceutical industries. The industry is really getting, horizontal as opposed to vertical, because of the investment in R&D, investment in manufacturing are getting a huge, number. It used to be, cost like a few $1 billion to, build a fab, one fab. Now it's $20 billion to construct one fab. Here in Japan, who can do it, right? But for the sake of national security, we do have to have some reasonable supply chain to de-risk future threats. So that's why the Japanese government is really investing into semiconductor industry right now. So really things are changing. As I see in 2019. Just building a semiconductor fab in Japan, people say, are you crazy? But now things are so different. And of course, there are a lot of criticism, which I hear, certainly. But this is, totally different. And it happened to be, highlighted by, COVID. People cannot really get semiconductors. That really interrupt our manufacturing industries.
So that's a good lead into our next question. You mentioned how even in 2019, things were just so different. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give us a sense of some of the highlights and lowlights over the past few years. For their industry, what have been some of the key successes and some of the really significant challenges with regard to supply chains? And where have the public and private sectors been able to work in concert? Where have they been at odds? So for this one, we'll start with Asai-san, and we can just go down the row.
So I mentioned earlier how energy supply chain has become a source of competition. It's an industrial policy in itself. On the positive side, we see a lot of collaboration among the countries in the region. Japanese government and private sector has entered into a lot of agreements with Australia to strengthen partnership in hydrogen, ammonia, carbon capture, and critical minerals. Similarly, for India, Japanese government is providing funds to boost renewable energy and energy efficiency. So all of this is a positive side. On the other hand, companies are experiencing a lot of challenges executing these projects. We see from news that large offshore wind project has been suspended or delayed due to changing circumstances. So these are big challenges. Just in Australia alone, there are over 100 hydrogen projects. So it's hard to believe that all of these 100 hydrogen projects will get to the finish line. So companies have a big challenge in order to get to know, execute these projects. So they need to have much more better understanding of the market and also to have a trusted network and really focus and be selective about how they manage risk and execute these projects. And similarly, in India, as more Indian government encourage supply chain to be shifted to India, more Japanese companies are doing that. But when I talk to the Indian stakeholders, they tell me that, well, Japanese companies are often very slow to make decisions, or they bring Japanese way of management, which does not fit into the local context. So again, there needs to be a much more deeper understanding of the market in order to make this possible. And most importantly, I'd like to say that energy transition is a journey. It doesn't happen overnight. So it's a phased approach where countries need to coordinate each other. I mentioned earlier how Japan is so dependent on the fuel sources from Australia. Now, if the size and the speed of the energy transition between Japan and Australia are not synchronized, Japan is going to face some serious energy security issues. So there needs to be a much better dialogue between government and the industry, and making sure that they fill the gap and bridge differences.
Thanks. Ambassador Clem from the Pharma.
Thank you. Just let me add a footnote to Koshiba-san's comments regarding the cost of bringing to market some of these technologies. Tufts University does an annual survey where they estimate the average cost of bringing a new drug, pharmaceutical treatment to market, and the time it takes to do so. In terms of duration, it's an average of 10 years from discovery through development and all the clinical trials to actually bringing a new product to market. In terms of cost, it's now $2.6 billion for each new medicine. And so it just points to the need for deep capital markets and patient investors. In terms of highlights and challenges, the highlight, I think, certainly was the fact that our supply chains held up and we were able to bring the vaccines in particular, but also subsequently therapies to patients around the world. The challenges were primarily policy. And this was true especially in the developing world, where we actually saw countries, you might remember, after well into the pandemic, so late 20, or during the course of 2021, raise tariffs on medicines, put in place export restrictions on pharmaceuticals, and then increase other border measures for various policy reasons in those countries. There are other countries, and including Japan, where the regulator took a very arguably appropriate but strict approach to registering and approving the vaccines. Those of us who were living in Japan in 2021 will remember there was a 5-month delay or so between the first jabs here in Japan compared to when Americans and Europeans started to receive the COVID vaccines. Probably the biggest policy distraction was what took place at the WTO. Again, this wasn't really implemented until 2022, but it was an effort by member countries within the WTO to put into place a waiver on intellectual property restrictions. The TRIPS waiver, the trade-related intellectual property protections were waived for the vaccines. This is something that naturally the pharmaceutical industry vehemently opposed, because intellectual property is really at the very core of our business. But it was approved, and it had the support of, unfortunately, both the United States and Japan. Its consequence in terms of actually bringing vaccines to a larger segment of the world's population was nil, because it didn't address the really critical problems of logistics and administration at the last mile that prevented many countries, or many individuals in many developing countries, from receiving vaccines on a timely and repeated basis. Now there's an effort to further extend that TRIPS waiver to COVID therapies as well. And again, we think that will do nothing to address issues like vaccine hesitancy and other barriers to receiving therapies around the world. And so what we would encourage, particularly in policy sense or policy advocacy, is that when the next pandemic hits, that countries ensure that that their trade rules are open to the quick and free flow of novel medicines, and also to the people and the technology that support ensuring that as many people as possible around the world have access to those drugs and therapies.
Can I just add on?
Of course, go ahead.
I just want to add, you did mention a really important point about the consistency of policy. So I also want to echo what Han said, is also for energy supply chain, the enduring policy and transparency and predictability of policy is so important for infrastructure investment, and even between friendly countries like Australia and Japan. If there has been some abrupt policy changes that has created confusion and uncertainty, and these will create problems. And even friendly countries that have been decades-long relationship, this fundamental relationship could change because of a policy from an energy point of view as well. So I think that was I forgot to mention that earlier, so I thought I'll mention that now.
Thank you. And I think semiconductors is one area where there has been some uncertainty and some changes in the policy. So in terms of highlights and lowlights, Kushiba-san, what have you seen there?
Sure. Highlights, I have two things I'd like to say. The first one is Rapidus. We started successfully. And when we are working on the Rapidus project, we really told government, because politicians would change, government official would change. So what we need is the solid bilateral agreement between Japan and the US to support, Rapidus to make it sustainable. That happened. And also, I've been telling, business community and also government officials saying that, really computation is most important things. Capability of computation and also computational resources to be provided to community. So government, understand that, and under U.S.-Japan bilateral agreement, NIDO, that is a funding agency of METI, decided to give money to RIKEN, which is a national science lab, to really hybridize U.S. quantum computer with a Japanese supercomputer, which is Fugaku. So, this would be a first, international event to develop such a most advanced, computation technology for the future. That's a highlight. My low light is that looking at generative AI, LLM, which is a big, surprise, and I like it. But the thing is that I'm so much worried about the digital deficit in Japan. As of 2021, Japanese government, Japanese corporate, we pay about $2.8 trillion, which is $20 billion to use that public cloud. Right? And of course, use of public cloud is kind of trend, but that's much money you're paying. Digital advertisement in Japan, our advertisement, market is about 7 trillion yen, and 40% is a digital, advertisement. That all goes to platformers in the U.S. So, but bad news is that the growth rate would be something like a 20 to 40% every year. So the $2.8 trillion we pay, for public cloud these days is going to increase to 8 trillion yen in 2030. Last year, we imported crude oil, right? 6.9 trillion yen. That really contributed to the depreciation of yen, right? So altogether, including buying AI, devices as well. This digital deficit is a really, serious issue for Japan and our competitiveness. And it's not really toward China, right? It's toward US, big techs. So that's something we have to be aware of. So we do need to have something, there's something we've been discussing these days, but after looking at OpenAI, this is additional source of the digital deficit, for Japan.
Interesting one, thanks. So I have one more question for the panel, and then we will open it up to all of you. So if we were sitting here 5 years from now in 2028, what are the main trends that we would be looking at? Which countries will have gained? Which countries will have had more challenges? And how successful will government and corporate efforts be to reconfigure supply chains for different benefits? And how will some of the emerging technologies we'll see today, you touched on generative AI, how will some of those affect supply chain organization and supply chain configurations? So Koshiba-san, we're going to go back to you, and then for this question, come back this direction, and then we'll open it up.
Sure. Again, back to technology, because I'm the only one technology guy here here at maybe GZERO Summit. Again, back to the issue of a computation, right? And the power of a computation is about grow like 10x every year. So in 2028, the power of computation is going to grow by 10 to the 4th power, and which is unprecedented level of the computation technologies. So as I see it, certainly AI technology, something like using NVIDIA, you really have to stay on NVIDIA for the next 2 years. But that NVIDIA itself has a supply issue eventually, because of the bottleneck of a, manufacturing, process. I don't want to get in trouble, but that's what our study says. And also, it has an issue of the power consumption. So there will be some innovation, I see that kind of kicking in 26. So eventually, the year of 28 will be a year of the quantum advantage. That's where the quantum computer comes in. That's going to affect all of you, business life and private life. And this is going to be a huge game changer. This is a time of the discontinuous change right now. So everybody have to really pay attention to, this kind of advances of computation technology.
Thanks. Go ahead.
Thanks. So today, everything's great, especially for the innovative segment of the pharmaceutical industry. There are, however, stable supply issues both in Japan and the United States. But this tends to be overwhelmingly focused in the generic segment of our industry. In the United States, more than 86% of unstable or medicines that find themselves in a situation of unstable supply are produced by generics. I think the number's even higher here in Japan. In 5 years' time, of course, we can't be complacent, and there are certainly member companies of pharma, both American and Japanese member companies, who are concerned about overdependence on China for precursors that go into our medicines, including APIs. And partially as a consequence of that, recently, Minister Nishimura, together with his American counterpart, Commerce Secretary Raimundo, in May of this year, agreed to add pharmaceutical supply chains, biopharmaceutical issues in general, and biotech startups to a bilateral government-to-government dialogue that was started a couple years ago. It's called the Japan-U.S. Commercial and Industrial Partnership. So actually, the industry was very, very happy that the two governments took up these issues, because for more than a decade, concerns and issues around, policy issues around the pharmaceutical industry had fallen off the U.S.-Japan bilateral agenda. What really worries us right now is actually the health of the Japanese innovation ecosystem for biopharma. Over the past decade or so, we've seen a steady decline in research and development investment in Japan, a steady decline in drug discovery and development. Japan 25 years ago was one of the major centers for drug discovery and development in the world. It's justifiably proud of 7 Nobel laureates in medicine and chemistry that contributed to pharmaceutical discoveries that benefited not only Japanese, but patients around the world. But this, the pipeline in terms of drug discovery and development has really shrunk. And China now has overtaken Japan, and even South Korea has done so in terms of drug discovery. And what this is contributing to is a growing, not only drug lag, but now drug loss, where that medicines that are available in other parts of the world are not available here in Japan for Japanese patients. Currently, 40%, only 40% of globally available medicines are available here in Japan. And we know already that that number is going to further decline, because we're by tracking clinical trials, phase 3 clinical trials in America and Europe, we can see that more than 70% are not headed for Japan. And so this is really an extraordinary situation for a country as rich as Japan. The industry is very eager to work with the government to encourage policy changes that would address some of these issues, particularly around the drug loss. And we're hopeful here that perhaps this GZERO, the Japan-U.S. Commercial Industrial Partnership, will provide a forum in which these issues can be discussed by the two governments. So hopefully in 5 years' time, the current declining trend in the innovation ecosystem in Japan will be reversed.
I agree with you.
Thank you.
So India is going to surpass Japan in terms of GDP in this decade. They are the innovation powerhouse. They are a big player in renewable energy, though still heavily dependent on coal. And there are, in India, technocrats who have industry-agnostic manufacturing capabilities, and it's just going to increase. So clearly, India is going to be the winner of this supply chain diversification. Japan would have increased its renewable energy by then, but still heavily dependent on imports of fuel. Japan may play some parts of the core components for clean energy, but as I said, in order to do so, Japanese company needs to have a global mindset and also improve speed to market. Australia will still be exporting LNG, but become a key player in the critical minerals, of course. They have one of the world's largest deposits of critical minerals. They have over 80 critical mineral projects in the pipeline. So clearly, they're going to play a big role. Having said that, I should emphasize that these ambitious country decarbonization goals may not be met by sufficient supply chain, because supply chain is a competition. So if they cannot get the power generation equipment or the equipment to expand the grid or the resources to maintain the infrastructure, it's just not going to happen. And from an energy point of view, we usually talk about 2030 and 2050. So I think the big challenge is getting from 2030 to 2050, the contemplated net zero world. Because for us to get there, it's just going to require technology that does not exist today. So I cannot emphasize more the importance of government and private sector to continue to invest, facilitate, and collaborate on the future technology beyond 2030.
All right. Thank you all so much. We have about 8 minutes left for questions. So who would like to ask something of any of our panelists? And if we need to warm up the room a little bit and get your juices flowing, I have one that just came up based on what the three of you just said. So I think some of you touched on it a bit, but what can the Japanese government do concretely, whether it's a question of investment, whether it's a question of regulation of some kind or encouragement or different incentives to do things like improve the digital deficit, the sort of drug deficit, I forget the term you used, and to spur the supply chain of renewable equipment. So what are some concrete steps that the government can do or that other countries can help out with? Whoever would like to start.
I can go first. So to address the drug lag and the declining or the weak innovation ecosystem here in Japan, we have 3 or 4 policy recommendations. One is to increase regulatory flexibility. As I mentioned before, there was a 4 or 5 month lag in 2021 for the COVID vaccines to come into Japan because of the Japanese regulators' requirement for an extra phase 3 clinical trial to ensure that ethnic differences in Japanese patients are properly analyzed in terms of the vaccine safety and efficacy. The industry believes that there are ways to address these concerns using technology, including AI, so that these additional phase 3 tests, which can be extremely expensive, are not required here in Japan. So that's one. Number 2, in the national health insurance system in Japan, of which the Japanese public and government should be justifiably proud. The effectiveness of the national health insurance system is borne out in longevity, in addition to many other indices. But it does, there's a very, very hard budget constraint that's placed on healthcare spending, and especially pharmaceutical spending. And this has resulted in price cuts being levied against innovative medicines during their patent period, which doesn't occur in any other developed country in the world. And we've asked the Japanese government to consider stop doing that. And the third thing, there are ways, although generics are very common in this market, including also other off-brand medicines that are called long-listed products. Their brand is still available, but they no longer have patent protection. These medicines take up a very large segment of pharmaceutical spending, particularly in contrast to other markets in the United States and Europe. And we've encouraged the government to find ways to expand both their use but lower the cost of these off-patent products. And finally, it's very important just to return the market to growth. Japan is the only developed market where the expenditures on pharmaceuticals has declined consistently over the past 4 years. And it's perverse almost, given that this is also a rapidly aging society. You would think that drug expenditures would be increasing. so that innovative medicines can be made available for Japanese patients, but it's not happening. And when you have a declining market, it's not surprising that you have declining levels of investment and also almost an absence of biotech startups in Japan, because the attractiveness for those companies is missing. So we've offered it.
Plenty we can do, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm part of the many government committees, and I learned to know how that the industry policies or technology science policies being made. And Kishida's initiative, New Form of Capitalism, calling for growth and redistribution. And growth policy, says extra emphasis on technologies. What he says is that try to revitalize Japan, based upon technologies. And for that, he's really talking about the AI, quantum, and bio. So as I see that government policies, they have done a good job to really formulate the technology, policies, and also providing enough subsidies or grants. What's missing is that top-down policy. Just like energy, self-sufficiency is like 12%. What do we do? What we have to do before 2035 to increase that number from 12% to maybe like 30%. How are we going to do with AI? How are we going to do with quantum? How are we going to do with bio, like a synthetic bio? Really a combination of many different technologies and a combination of deep regulations. That's going to really, help us to achieve that kind of top-down goal. I'm not particularly fond of Mr. Trump, but I like his Operation Warp Speed. Just provide, COVID is trivial. We're going to give you like vaccines like within a year, and he did it. Actually Biden did it, right? But the thing is that that kind of things like a moonshot type goal. That's something we are missing here in Japan.
And your question was about how government can support renewable energy. So I would also say government has done a great job in promoting renewable energy in this country. We are growing capacity. So a lot of work has been done. But as I mentioned earlier, the consistency of regulation and rules is so important for these infrastructure projects, from permitting to bidding rules to all other kinds of environmental assessment. These rules can be improved even further. But I will also come back to what I mentioned earlier, because energy security and energy supply chain is all about competition, global competition. So Japan needs to decide where do we compete and where do we cooperate, and make that strategy with the global partners. That's important. And also I mentioned about execution. So there are many funds, a lot of commitments made at COP this week. There's enough capital, but the companies are struggling to execute this project, and you hear offshore wind projects being suspended and delayed and doesn't happen. So how do we bridge this gap between there's fund, but how do we improve the execution? I don't have the answer. I wish I have, but this is a collaboration that needs to take place between government and industry.
So I apologize. I did not mean for my question to take up the time that we had remaining for Q&A. I hope there aren't too many people who didn't have a chance to ask their questions. But I was just thinking as we were talking here that the panel I moderated earlier this morning on artificial intelligence, I feel like in the realm of AI we have more questions than answers, and that contrasts for me with this discussion on supply chains, where we know the questions, but that doesn't mean that we yet have the answers. So there are plenty of opportunities in each of these industries and in many, many other industries for governments and the private sector to work together, for governments and for capital to come up with the investments that are necessary, to create regulation or loosen regulation as needed, So I think this is still, an example of one area where it's much more of a tangible issue. It's something that we know so much more. That doesn't mean it makes it easy. And so I really appreciate each of our panelists elucidating for us some of those questions and some of the potential answers. So thank you all very much for staying even through, to the afternoon. And thanks very much to the panelists.
Thank you, Caitlin.
Thank you. Thank you.